Chapter 1. The Making of an Iron Queen. The story of this female monarch, Ranavalona I, began in the misty highlands of Madagascar. She was born around 1778, in a land that would one day tremble at the mention of her name. Her birth name was Ramavo, a girl of modest nobility, raised within the intricate web of marina politics, a world where alliances were made with blood, and the survival of a family depended on which whisper reached the palace first. Her father, an observant man of keen instinct, once uncovered a plot to murder the great King Ranavalona, the unifier of the Highlands. It was an act of loyalty that would change the course of Ramavo's life. The king, indebted to the man who had saved him, swore that his son, the young Prince Radama, would take Ramavo as one of his wives. And so she was brought to court, not as a lover chosen by fate, but as a token of gratitude, a pawn in the board game of dynasties. When Radama ascended the throne in 1810, Madagascar entered a new age. The young king was brilliant, ambitious, and fascinated by Europe. He welcomed British missionaries, adopted European-style uniforms for his soldiers, and opened his capital to foreign trade and Western schooling. The island began to stir with new words: progress, learning, civilization. Words that seemed to float uneasily above the red soil of a still ancient land. Ramavo watched quietly from the palace corridors. She listened to the missionaries speak in strange tongues, watched the priests draw crosses in the air, and saw her husband drink foreign wine and dream of foreign alliances. She smiled when required, bowed when expected, and remembered everything. She understood that with every book printed in Madagascar, with every British rifle unloaded at the port, the kingdom's soul drifted further from its roots. She also understood something else. Power is a patient art, and patience was a virtue she possessed in abundance. When King Radama fell ill and died in 1828, he left no heir to carry his name. The throne was suddenly vacant, and the royal court, that boiling cauldron of jealous generals and ambitious princes, erupted in whispers. The law said that a male relative should rule, but the law in Madagascar was only as strong as the sword that enforced it. In the dead of night, as the city slept under the breath of the monsoon wind, Ramavo made her move. She had spent years cultivating allies among the royal guard, the keepers of the sacred idols, and those ministers who feared foreign meddling more than they loved reform. Before dawn, the palace gates were sealed. Loyal soldiers moved like shadows through the corridors, arresting rival claimants, silencing dissenters before their voices could rise. When the first drums thundered across Madagascar at sunrise, the crowd saw her, draped in royal silk, flanked by the bearers of sacred spears, stepping out into the courtyard as Ranavalona I, the sovereign queen of Madagascar. Her coronation was not merely a ceremony. It was a conquest. The priests pressed the ancient royal talismans, the sampi, against her brow, declaring that the spirits of the ancestors had chosen her. To disobey her was to defy the very gods that governed rain and harvest. The army saluted, the drums rolled, and the court bowed in fearful silence. That morning, a new era began, one that would be remembered not for its golden palaces or its foreign diplomacy, but for its iron will and rivers of blood. From the first days of her reign, Ranavalona reversed the direction in which the wind had been blowing. She ordered that foreign missionaries be expelled or closely watched, that schools teaching in English be shut down, and that the ancestral rituals the invocations, the sacrifices, the sacred dances be restored to the center of national life. To her, the European presence was not progress, but infection, a creeping poison that softened the discipline of her people. Yet she was no simple xenophobe. She was clever, dangerously so, and she knew that total isolation was suicide. Among the few Europeans she tolerated was a Frenchman named Jean Laborde, a gifted engineer who built her a new kind of power. Deep in the forest of Mantassoa, he constructed an industrial complex that turned ore into cannon and clay into muskets. Under his supervision, Malagasy workers forged tools, wove uniforms, and produced gunpowder. In her mind, this was the only kind of foreign aid worth having, not the Bible, but the rifle. Ranavalona's reign, in many ways, became a paradox, a fortress of isolation that relied on modern machinery, a spiritual monarchy that ruled with administrative precision, a woman who preached ancestral purity yet employed a European to arm her soldiers. But at the heart of this paradox was a single conviction: to remain independent, Madagascar must become untouchable. And to become untouchable, she would rule through fear. The queen surrounded herself with a labyrinth of informants. Spies drifted through the markets, listening for careless words. Courtiers bowed too long or too short and were suddenly accused of plotting rebellion. The walls of her palace echoed with silence, the kind that only terror can teach. Her justice was not blind. It was omniscient. It saw through walls, through prayers, through thoughts unspoken. It was said that even the air carried her ears. Her instrument of governance was the mandatory service for the queen. It was the duty of unpaid service owed by every subject to the crown. It was an ancient custom, but under her it hardened into a national chain. Thousands of peasants were drafted to build roads that crumbled in the rains, to haul timber up cliffs for palaces they would never enter, and to march on endless military campaigns against coastal tribes. They died of exhaustion, hunger, or fever, and their families were left with nothing but silence. The queen's kingdom grew stronger, but her people grew fewer. Foreign envoys would later describe her as the female Nero of Africa, a tyrant who mistook cruelty for sovereignty. Yet that image, while not false, misses something essential. Ranavalona was not mad. She was methodical. She understood the fragility of sovereignty in a century when European empires swallowed entire continents. The British had taken Mauritius. The French had claimed the islands beyond. Madagascar was next. She would not let that happen, not while she breathed. And so, for 33 years, she ruled like a storm given flesh. Her reign was a study in paradox. A queen who preserved her nation's independence by destroying its peace. A ruler who defended her culture by drowning it in fear. Under her gaze, loyalty was not rewarded, it was demanded, and demanded absolutely. When she walked through her palace courtyard, surrounded by guards and priests, the people lowered their heads to the ground, not out of reverence, but survival. And yet, for all her terror, the island remained unconquered. The foreign gunboats came, circled, and left again. The European missionaries cursed her from afar. The mountains held. Ranavalona I, the Iron Queen, had done the impossible. She had built a wall around her kingdom, a wall made of superstition, labor, and blood. It would take decades and the death of tens of thousands, but for her, the price of sovereignty was worth every life spent to secure it. Chapter 2. The Poison Trials. The morning air in Madagascar was thin, clear, and trembling with the hum of drums. I remember the way the crowd moved slow, reluctant, like a tide pulled by fear rather than curiosity. They came because the Queen's law demanded it. Justice, they said, must be seen to be believed. In the center of the square, guards had cleared a space the color of rust. 3 wooden bowls waited on the ground, each filled with cloudy liquid that shimmered faintly in the sun. A priest of the royal idols, bare-chested, his hair bound with red cloth, stood over them, whispering the words that would turn poison into prophecy. This was Tangena, the ordeal that decided guilt and innocence not by evidence, but by survival. The first prisoner was a farmer, accused of stealing a goat from a noble's herd. His wrists were bound, his eyes wide with that peculiar mixture of terror and hope that men wear when heaven itself is judged. He knelt, swallowed 3 small bits of chicken skinballs of his oath, and lifted the bowl to his lips. The crowd held its breath. The liquid was made from the nut of the Tangena tree, its sap thick with a toxin that stops the heart. If the man could vomit the chicken skins intact, he was innocent. If not well, the earth would claim him. The law said that truth revealed itself in his stomach. He drank. He coughed once, twice, then collapsed forward. The guards stepped back. The priest watched the spasms run their course, then signaled to the scribes to record the verdict. Guilty. The body was dragged away by the ankles, leaving a thin trail in the dust. Somewhere, his wife screamed and stopped, because the sound itself could be dangerous here. I had seen death before. But the strangest part was not the dying. It was the silence that followed. No one whispered, no one wept. The people stood perfectly still, as if afraid that pity might be mistaken for dissent. That was the genius and the horror of Ranavalona's justice. She had taken an old ritual of divine trial and woven it into the fabric of government. It was law, religion, and terror braided into one. From her palace above the city, Ranavalona had decreed that the ordeal be used for crimes both sacred and secular: theft, adultery, witchcraft, conspiracy, even the suspicion of speaking ill of the crown. Entire villages could be summoned when one man was accused. If the accused was of high status, a wife, a child, or a slave might drink in his place proof by proxy. They called it. If the substitute died, guilt was confirmed. The logic was circular but unbreakable, like the Queen's rule itself. Records from the 1830s suggest that thousands faced the ordeal each year. In some districts, missionary observers claimed that 1/5 of all deaths came from Tangena. Their numbers may have been colored by outrage, but the graves were real enough. Hillsides that once held rice terraces turned into burial fields. Families vanished in a single season. Whole lineages were erased, their names struck from tax rolls and temple walls. Every trial followed the same rhythm. Drums called the people to gather. Priests sprinkled the ground with ash. The accused swore innocence before the ancestors, then knelt to receive the bowl. If he vomited the 3 chicken skins intact, he was cleansed and released, though his body might tremble for days. If he failed, he was dragged outside the village and left for the ants and birds. But the poison did more than kill. It conquered the mind. People began to police themselves long before the soldiers arrived. Neighbors reported to each other to avoid suspicion. Wives betrayed husbands. Sons denounced fathers, each hoping the Queen's wrath would pass them by. The ordeal became a language everyone understood. Disobedience meant death by your own hand. Missionaries exiled from Madagascar later wrote that the Tangena devoured more of the Queen's people than war. Famine and pestilence combined. Hyperbole, perhaps, but the scale was enormous. Population registers from the mid-century show entire communes shrinking. Villages that once numbered hundreds now counted dozens. The poison trial had become a quiet genocide of fear. Yet it would be too easy, and perhaps dishonest, to see Ranavalona as merely bloodthirsty. She ruled in an age when European gunboats prowled the coasts, when neighboring kingdoms fell one by one to the flags of France and Britain. To her, unity was survival. Dissent, even rumor, was a crack in the wall of sovereignty. Tangena was not madness, it was control. Delivered in a language everyone understood. By delegating judgment to the poison, she removed herself from guilt. The spirits had spoken. She merely obeyed. The bureaucracy of terror had found its divine loophole. And in that loophole, thousands disappeared. The day's second accused was a woman, a servant accused of adultery with her master's brother. She was young, maybe 20, her wrists bound with reeds instead of rope. The priest recited the incantation. She repeated it softly, her voice steady, her eyes fixed on the distant palace. When she drank, the crowd murmured a prayer, neither for her life nor her soul, but for their own safety. She lasted longer than the man. Her breathing slowed, then quickened, then stopped. The guards crossed their spears before her body, a signal that judgment had been carried out. A soldier dipped a branch in water and flicked droplets toward the crowd, a ritual cleansing. The people flinched as the cold drops touched their skin. By sunset, the square smelled of bile and smoke. A dozen bowls lay overturned. The priests packed their charms, the scribes their tablets. The crowd dispersed quietly, returning to homes that felt smaller now, as if the poison still lingered in the air. Outside Madagascar, the ordeal spread through the provinces like a fever. In Ambatondrazaka, missionaries recorded entire congregations summoned after the discovery of a stolen ox. In Betsilio, the poison was mixed with stronger herbs to ensure quick verdicts. The dead were buried in shallow pits beside the roads. Markers carved with nothing but a single cross-shaped notch symbol. Perhaps, or merely the tool mark of haste. For more than 3 decades, this was justice in Madagascar. It did not rely on prisons or paperwork. It required no armies to maintain. Fear did the work of soldiers, and faith sealed it. When the Queen died in 1861, the Tangena trials waned almost overnight. Her successor, Ranavalona II, banned them formally, calling the practice a poison to the body and to the soul. But the memory endured. For another generation, parents warned their children not to speak ill of the crown, for the spirits might still demand proof. Modern historians still argue the numbers. Was it hundreds of thousands, or merely tens of thousands? The truth lies somewhere in that vast gray space where records fail and graves have no names. What no one disputes is the psychological mark it left. A society taught to equate obedience with survival, silence with virtue. As night fell over the highlands, the fires from the day's ordeal flickered out, leaving only the hum of insects and the faraway drums from the palace. In that darkness, one could almost understand Ranavalona's logic. She ruled a kingdom encircled by empires, a queen alone against the world. To keep her throne, she forged a weapon more powerful than gunpowder. Fear sanctified as faith, And though the poison claimed thousands, it also achieved its terrible purpose. Madagascar remained uncolonized for the rest of her life. Chapter 3. Faith on the Scaffold. The year was 1835, and the bells of the capital had fallen silent. Their chime, once used to call pupils to the mission schools, was forbidden now. The Queen had spoken. The foreigner's faith is a disease. Let it be cut out. From the hilltop palace, her decree rolled outward like thunder over the rice fields. Churches were shuttered, Bibles burned, teachers dispersed. At first, people thought the storm would pass. But Ranavalona was not a woman of half measures. The order was not a warning. It was the beginning of a purge in the narrow alleys below the palace. Small groups of Malagasy Christians met in secret. They whispered hymns in storage huts, hiding their candles behind water jars so the glow would not betray them. They still used the word Andromeda, the Creator, but now they spoke it softly, as if it might summon soldiers. It was not long before the spies came. A single informer, sometimes a neighbor, sometimes a cousin, was enough to send an entire household before the court. The Queen's guards dragged them to the palace square, where the priests of the old gods waited. To the missionaries already expelled to Mauritius, the reports would read like martyrdoms from another century. One morning in 1837, the Queen herself appeared on the balcony of her stone palace. She was dressed in scarlet silk, her face unreadable. Below, a line of prisoners knelt, men, women, and even 2 children barely into adolescence. The royal herald called out their crime. They have abandoned the ancestors and followed the foreign god. Ranavalona's voice carried over the crowd. Whoever bows to another god betrays the blood of Madagascar, she said. Let their deaths teach loyalty. She did not need to raise her hand. The guards knew what to do. Among those condemned was a young woman named Ranavalona, once a servant in a noble house. She refused to renounce her faith, even after weeks of imprisonment. On the day of her execution, they tied her wrists with fiber cords and led her barefoot through the city. People lined the streets in silence. Some turned away. Others stared, hoping that looking might somehow count as compassion. At the edge of the city stood the cliff of Ampamariana, the place of hurling. It overlooked the valley like a gaping mouth. There, guards offered her one last chance. Spit on the cross and live. She shook her head in defiance. The wind carried her final prayer down into the valley, and then the soldiers did their work. No one cheered, no one clapped. The crowd only exhaled when it was over, as though the mountain itself had demanded breath in exchange for mercy. Ranavalon's name spread in whispers. Converts began to call her child of God. Her death, meant to erase the faith, became its seed. After that day, the killings acquired rhythm and bureaucracy. The Queen's edict required every official to report foreign worship within his district. Some local chiefs obeyed out of zeal, others out of fear. Accused Christians were paraded through towns, bound together by ropes twisted from palm fiber. Confession was extracted not through flame or rack, but through the exhaustion of humiliation days of exposure, fasting, and blows from bamboo rods. Many recanted publicly to save their families. They were forced to stamp on crucifixes or swallow bits of sacred paper soaked in mud to prove contempt for the foreign god. The rest, those who refused, disappeared into the prisons beneath the palace, where damp stone and darkness did the slow work that swords once did quickly. From 1835 to 1849, the persecutions came in waves. Each time a drought struck or a rebellion flared on the coast, the priests told the queen the ancestors were angry and the Christians were blamed again. Hundreds died in those cycles. Thousands were enslaved or exiled to remote provinces. In the highland valleys, entire congregations vanished. The roads filled with refugees moving by night, carrying only torn pages of scripture hidden under their clothes. But belief is hard to bury. In the villages beyond the capital, families kept fragments of the banned Bible inside hollow bamboo tubes. Mothers whispered hymns while pounding rice, letting the rhythm of the pestle mask the melody. Men carved small crosses on the undersides of stools or into the handles of plows, signs that the Queen's guards would never notice. Missionaries abroad heard rumors of this church under the ground. They smuggled letters back into the island through sailors and merchants, promising that one day the persecutions would end. Those promises took decades to reach the people who needed them. Women bore the heaviest share of the punishment. In Ranavalona's world, the disobedience of a woman toward her husband mirrored the disobedience of a subject toward the crown. When female converts refused to denounce their faith, they were used as spectacles, stripped of status, forced to carry stones on their heads through the streets, sometimes marched naked under the lash while crowds were ordered to watch in silence. The purpose was not simply torture or death. It was a lesson, a bloody, real-life tale. The Queen wanted the people to see any foreign faith punished not behind walls, but under sunlight, where the example would burn into memory of the public dot. In 1849, a renewed campaign swept the capital. Dozens of nobles and artisans were accused of hiding Christian gatherings. Some were speared at dawn. Others were bound and thrown from the cliffs of the city. The royal scribes tallied each sentence like a census. Missionary letters from abroad claimed more than 1,000 souls perished in that season alone. Even if numbers blurred in transmission, the grief behind them was genuine. When the killing ended, Madagascar's capital smelled of smoke and wet clay. A foreign visitor years later wrote that the air itself seemed haunted. Survivors carried that silence into old age. Even decades afterward, they spoke of the persecutions in half sentences, as if the Queen's spies might still be listening. To understand the savagery is to understand Ranavalona's fear. She believed Christianity was not merely a rival faith, but a Trojan horse for conquest. To her, every hymn was an act of treason, every foreign word a whisper of invasion. By crushing the converts, she believed she was crushing colonization itself. And in a cruel way, she was right. While African kingdoms around her were annexed by empires, Madagascar remained unconquered. Independence was preserved, but purchased at the price of her people's peace. When Ranavalona died in 1861, survivors emerged cautiously into daylight. They rebuilt chapels, reclaimed cemeteries, sang the hymns aloud again. But the sound had changed. It carried the echo of those who had fallen from their cliffs or vanished into the palace dungeons. Asterisk faith in Madagascar would forever bear her scar. For 30 years, the Queen had tried to silence that song. In doing so, she gave it a body of stone and air, a monument that no empire could tear down. Chapter 4. The Tyranny of Labor. The monarch had a name for forced labor of public, and in her realm they called it the service to the Queen. It was spoken with both pride and dread. In the old days, it meant helping your sovereign for a few weeks a year, repairing roads, building walls, carrying the royal drums during festivals. Under Ranavalona, it became something different, something harder. It became the spine of her kingdom and the chain that bound it. Each year her heralds rode through the valleys, reading the summons aloud in the language of command. "The queen requires hands," they said, and no one dared ask whose hands would return. Families marked their sons with charcoal before they left, so that if a body came back, they would know it by the stained dot in her castle. The queen planned works of impossible scale, palaces of stone, roads cut through mountains, iron foundries hidden in the forest. Jean the Board, her French engineer, drew the plans, but it was Malagasy flesh that brought them to life. They came by the thousands, barefoot, carrying nothing but a mat and a handful of rice. Guards counted them, branded their names into ledgers, and sent them marching toward the hills. Days began before dawn. The overseer's horns called them from sleep, and the long lines of workers shuffled to the quarries. The sun rose, hot and white, and the dust began to choke the air. Men swung hammers until their palms split. Women carried baskets of rock balanced on their heads. When one fell, another stepped forward. No one stopped to help. The work could not stop. The queen's orders reached even here, carried by rumor and fear. Those who rest betray the throne. The food was a thin porridge of rice husks and water. Nights were colder than the day was cruel. Workers slept in trenches beside their tools, dreaming of home and waking to the same ache in their limbs. Disease moved among them like a quiet spirit, malaria from the swamps, fever from the wounds. There were no healers, only overseers. Sometimes the queen came herself to see what her kingdom was becoming. The soldiers swept the roads before her, scattering the sick into the forest, so her procession would not have to look upon them. She rode beneath a parasol, the sunlight catching the gold thread of her robe. To those who survived, she looked like a statue carved out of certainty, unblinking, untouched by dust. She would nod once, and the overseers would strike their whips against the ground, not at her, not at the workers, just at the earth, as if to remind it who ruled. For the queen, the service was more than labor. It was loyalty made visible. The palaces that rose from the hills were her proof that the ancestors favored her reign. Each block of stone was an offering, each corpse a sacrifice to independence. She would say to her council, "Better the sweat of my people than the blood of my nation." And those who heard her did not dare to wonder whether. In the end, the two had become the same. The road to the coast was the worst of all. It snaked through jungle and ravine, 250 miles of red mud. Porters carried muskets, iron bars, bolts of cloth, even the queen's throne itself on their shoulders. The heat there was a living thing, and when it pressed down, men simply fell. The guards did not beat them. They only removed the loads and placed them on another back. The road was paved with the silence of those who would never reach the sea dot at Madagascar. The foundry burned day and night. The air tasted of charcoal and metal. Inside, the clang of iron on iron never ceased. They made muskets for an army that would guard a queen who trusted no one. They made cannon that were never fired in battle, and plows that never reached the fields. The iron was a symbol, nothing more a way of telling the world that Madagascar could make its own weapons, and would therefore not surrender. While the men labored in the hills, the women kept the capital alive. They harvested rice, tended fires, hauled water up the steep stairways of the city. Some were ordered to weave silk for the court their fingers raw from the thread. Others were summoned to the palace kitchens, where they cooked for soldiers while their own children starved at home. In the countryside, whole villages stood half empty, their fields overgrown. The land forgot its farmers. Year after year, the summons came again. Droughts followed, then famine. Without the men to till the soil, the granaries thinned. Some families sold their children to nobles to buy another season of food. Others fled into the forests, where the queen's laws could not reach them. The census takers recorded fewer names each decade. A traveler in the 1850s wrote that the road to Madagascar was lined with silence and graves. And yet, through it all, there was a terrible pride. The same people who cursed the queen in whispers also told their children that Madagascar remained free while the great empires devoured the world. They pointed to the walls of her palace, to the iron cannon cast by their own hands, and said, "No foreigner built that." It was truth wrapped in tragedy. By the end of Ranavalona's reign, the service for the queen had consumed a generation. Some historians would later estimate that the island's population fell by nearly a third during her 33 years on the throne. Numbers fade, but memory endures. The ghost of the hammer echoing through the hills. The ache in the bones of a nation that labored itself nearly to death to stay sovereign. When the queen finally died in 1861, her people did not weep in public. They simply stopped working. For the first time in decades, the roads lay empty, the hammers quiet. The silence that followed her passing was not mourning. It was disbelief. The world had turned without her command. In the years that followed, the new king eased the burden. Wages replaced conscription, and the fields slowly filled again. But the habit of obedience lingered. Even freed men still bowed to invisible overseers. Hearing the echo of horns that no longer blew, Ranavalona had built her monument's stone walls. Iron foundries, roads cut into the mountain, and they endured. Yet her greatest monument was the invisible one, the discipline of fear, the reflex of silence, the knowledge carved into every survivor that freedom can be as cruel as bondage when bought at too high a price. And so the hammers fell silent, leaving only the wind over the highlands. The people listened to it and tried to remember the last sound they heard before the silence began. Some said it was the queen's final breath, others the striking of the last stone. But those who had labored the longest swore it was the heartbeat of Madagascar itself. Chapter 5. The Great Purge of 1857. The year was 1857, and the air over Madagascar carried the weight of something unspoken. The queen had ruled for nearly 3 decades. Her hair had silvered, her gaze had not. Around her, the palace had grown like a fortress of mirrors, every corridor filled with echoes of her own suspicion. Those who served her had learned to bow before they breathed. Yet beneath the surface of her iron reign, change was stirring. The kind of change that travels in whispers before it explodes into thunder. For years, her son, Prince Rakoto, had lived inside that tension. Born of the same blood, but of another mind, he had watched his mother's empire harden into fear. He admired the foreigners she hated, admired their books, their machines, their idea of progress. He wrote secret letters to the outside world, letters that began, "My people thirst for light," to the Queen. Such words would sound like treason wrapped in poetry. Among his circle was the French merchant Joseph Lambert, a man of restless ambition. Lambert and the aging engineer, Jean Laborde, had built fortunes under Ranavalona's grudging tolerance, always careful to flatter her while dreaming of the day her son would rule. Together they drafted a charter, a grand design for the future of Madagascar, an agreement that promised French investors land, mines, and trade rights once Rakoto became king. They sealed it with signatures and secrecy, believing the queen too old and too proud to notice. But the palace walls had ears. A servant overheard fragments of a conversation. A translator caught sight of a map marked with French flags. And by midsummer, the rumor reached the queen's chamber. The queen listened, silent at first, her fingers tapping the arm of her throne. Then she rose and said only, "The rats are nesting in my house." Within hours, the purge began. Soldiers filled the streets before dawn. The city awoke to the sound of boots on stone and the creak of doors forced open. Houses belonging to nobles, known to favor the prince, were surrounded. Servants were dragged into the courtyards, questioned, beaten, released, or disappeared. The queen's secretaries worked through the night, drawing up lists that lengthened with every whisper. The board was placed under guard. Lambert fled toward the coast, and Prince Rakoto was confined to his chambers. His correspondence confiscated. For a week, Madagascar lived on edge. Courtiers spoke in riddles. Even Theroyalpriests murmured religious idols softly, as if afraid the gods themselves might be accused of disloyalty. The queen summoned her council in the great hall. She sat high on her carved throne, the firelight painting her face in copper. The air was thick with incense and fear. One by one, the accused were brought forward: ministers, soldiers, servants, men who had once dined at her table. Each was questioned, and each in turn blamed another. Suspicion spread faster than guilt. By the time the queen dismissed the council, half the court was afraid of the other half. Over the next few days, the prisons filled. Some captives were interrogated in the chambers below the palace, where the air stank of sweat and torch smoke. Others were forced to march through the streets, heads shaved, placards hanging from their necks declaring traitor to the queen. Their families were stripped of titles and property, their houses seized, their lands annexed to the crown. No one knew how many died: dozens, perhaps hundreds. But every household under her rule lost someone to the silence. Outside the capital, the purges rolled through the provinces. Governors who hesitated to enforce them were themselves accused of sympathy with the prince. In the coastal towns, soldiers executed merchants suspected of trading with foreigners. The roads became lines of exiles, chained together, trudging toward penal settlements in the eastern forests. Madagascar had seen terror before, but never so organized, never so methodical. In the midst of it all, the queen maintained her daily ritual. Audiences in the morning, councils at noon, prayers to the ancestors at dusk. To the terrified courtiers who knelt before her, she seemed unchanged, calm, almost serene. Only her eyes betrayed a deeper exhaustion, the cold weariness of a ruler who had outlived trust. "They dream of my death," she told her attendants, "but it is I who hold the island's breath in my hands." Prince Rakoto waited for his chance to speak. When it came, he knelt at her feet, presenting himself as a dutiful son. He swore that he had never plotted her overthrow, that Lambert had tricked him with promises of friendship and progress. The queen listened, her expression unreadable. Some say she believed him. Others say she simply chose not to kill her heir. Whatever the truth, the prince was spared. The others were not. The executions began at dawn on the hill outside the city. The condemned were led out in small groups, flanked by guards carrying spears polished for the occasion. There was no ceremony, no speeches. The soldiers did their work quickly, efficiently. When it was done, the bodies were buried in unmarked ground, the soil packed flat so that no one could return to mourn. The queen's scribes recorded the names on a single scroll that would later vanish into the archives. As if erasing memory itself was part of the sentence. In the weeks that followed, fear thickened the air like smoke. Courtiers smiled too broadly, bowed too low. The markets whispered that even the ancestors trembled. Yet life went on. The palace drums still beat, the fires in Madagascar still burned. Queen Ranavalona had purged her court, but in doing so, she had also purged its heart. What remained was obedience without conviction, loyalty without love. As summer faded, the queen walked the terrace of her palace, overlooking her capital. The roofs below gleamed under the sun. The fields beyond shimmered green. She had survived another conspiracy, another threat to her throne. The island was still hers, but something had changed. The cheers that once greeted her processions had become murmurs, the songs of the laborers dull and joyless. Even the wind through the pines sounded cautious. Those who saw her in her final years described a woman diminished but unbroken, pacing the marble floors surrounded by relics of a past she had both built and bled for. The Great Purge had secured her rule. It had also marked the beginning of its end. The queen had silenced every voice that might have told her the truth, that the world outside her island was moving, that empires were tightening their nets. In killing her fear, she had killed her sight. The Purge of 1857 had been meant to cleanse the court of betrayal. Instead, it left the island hollow, its defenders gone, its spirit exhausted. Yet even in ruin, Ranavalona's shadow lingered. Her name became a warning, her memory a monument to the cost of survival. For more than 30 years, she had ruled through fear. The Purge was her final act of faith in that method. It worked for a moment. Then history, patient as the tide, began to rise around her walls. Chapter 6. Aftermath and Legacy. The queen died quietly, almost invisibly, in her sleep, after 33 years of rule that had filled the island with drumbeats and dread. The moment of her passing was strangely ordinary. Outside her palace, the guards still paced, unaware that the woman they protected had already stepped into the company of the ancestors. When word spread at dawn, on August 16, 1861, the capital Antananarivo did not erupt in grief or celebration. It exhaled a long, uncertain breath, as if the whole city had been holding it for a lifetime. For hours, the bells remained silent. Then the courtiers, careful and nervous, began the rituals of succession. The throne passed to her only son, Radama, the prince she had once confined. He appeared on the balcony in a white robe rather than the crimson of his mother, and he spoke softly where she had thundered. And his first decree dissolved the Tangena ordeal. His second invited the missionaries and foreign envoys to return to the people. It felt like light after a storm dazzling, almost painful, but light can be treacherous when eyes have lived too long in darkness. The nobles, who had survived Ranavalona's purges, eyed this new openness with suspicion. They had learned under her rule that favor changes faster than wind. Now the young king welcomed Europeans back into the capital, signed trade charters, and spoke of treaties, the same names his mother had cursed now appeared at royal banquets. In the marketplaces. Whispers began again. The island is being sold for silver. Radama's reign would last barely 2 years. In 1863, his own guards turned against him, strangled him in his palace, and installed his widow, Queen Ranavalona, as a figurehead. The circle of blood had closed, the son undone by the very openness his mother had feared. Through it all, the people of Madagascar carried both rulers in their memories. The mother who had ruled by terror, the son who had died by trust. Under Ranavalona and her successors, the island moved cautiously toward the world beyond its coasts. French and British missions reopened. Merchants returned. The ironworks at Nautasoa fell silent. For a generation, the memory of Ranavalona was something whispered, half shame and half pride. To the elders, Queen Ranavalona was still the queen who kept the foreigners out. To the younger men educated in mission schools, she was the tyrant who had burned their teachers alive. History had split itself in two, and both halves were true. The foreigners never forgot her either. In Paris, she was remembered as the savage queen who poisoned her people. In London, pamphlets called her the female Nero of the Indian Ocean. Their writers rarely saw that, beneath the cruelty, her rule had also preserved something no empire could give back once taken independence. While much of Africa fell under European flags in the 19th century, Madagascar remained sovereign until 1895. More than 30 years after her death. By then the French finally conquered the island. Marching up the same roads her laborers had built and occupying the very palace she had guarded with fear. Her walls outlived her. But they could not outlive time. After the conquest, colonial administrators tried to erase her memory. They built offices where her prisons had stood, renamed the avenues she had paved, hung portraits of European governors in her reception hall. Yet the people still told stories. In those stories, Ranavalona walked the palace corridors at night, her bare feet leaving no sound, searching for the throne she had refused to surrender. Children whispered that when the wind howled over Antananarivo, it was the queen calling the island to vigilance. Now, in the 20th century, her legend softened. Scholars began to weigh the accounts of her reign, comparing missionary letters with Malagasy oral histories. Maybe she had not been a madwoman thirsting for blood. She may have been a monarch playing the only card left to a small, proud nation in an age of empires. Her cruelty had been a strategy, her isolation a shield. And though the shield cut her own hands, it had kept the island free while others fell. Still, freedom purchased by fear leaves scars that do not fade. For generations, the Malagasy learned to bow first and speak later, to weigh every word, to obey before questioning. Her rule had created a habit of caution, a habit that outlasted the dynasty itself. Today, when the sun sets over the hills of the central plateau, its light catches the walls of the old palace. Now weathered and pale, Queen Ranavalona was not the first ruler to confuse fear with strength, nor the last, but she stands apart because she was a woman alone on a throne built for men, defending an island against the hunger of empires. She lived long enough to see her enemies wait in frustration just beyond her shores, and she died believing she had saved her people. Perhaps in a narrow sense, she had. The tragedy is that the salvation she offered was survival without mercy. When night falls over the capital, Antananarivo, The city glows with electric lights where her torches once burned,